This time on Poll Hub, polls, and lots of them. What do the latest round of surveys from us and others mean for the November election? Well, plenty of people are drawing plenty of conclusions, and we will share ours. Spoiler alert, it's still very early. Then, as the pandemic resurges in dangerous ways across the U.S., what happens afterwards? What happens on the other side of this? We've gone back in history, looked at polls, looked at what has happened to see what it can tell us about what we might expect. We have lots to talk about, so let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I've been promoted to the second introduction. I'm Miringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion. Barb?
Oh, and I've been, I don't know, they saved the best for last.
Yes.
I'm Marist College, Director of the Marist Poll. So, boy, you guys aren't kidding when you're saying there's been a lot of polls out lately. Certainly with everything that's going on in the economy, with the protests, with the virus, and with the virus escalating in a number of states around the country. What do pollsters do? Well, we call people and talk to them and ask them what they think about it. So we actually have some numbers out with our partners, NPR and the PBS NewsHour, just on President Trump himself and his job approval rating. Right now, although we didn't see a huge movement for the president, 40% of Americans say they approve of the job that he's doing. 58% say that they disapprove, which is actually the highest number that we have had during his presidency. So guys, like, what's going on? Are you surprised that we really didn't see a huge change? I know there are a number of other polls out today and in the last few days that have shown some dramatic shifts, particularly among independents for the president. Are we an outlier?
No, I think that these numbers suggest, I think more than anything, that a lot of this is baked in. There's not a lot of people floating around at this point, but I did see one number, and I would recommend that people just check the party spread within the different polls, because of the strong Democrat-Republican differences in party preferences, both for Trump approval and the toss-up question. That can be very determining.
You mean the margin between the
how many Democrats, how many
and
Republicans each poll found? And this one, I believe, was plus 8 Democrat. If I'm not mistaken, and we did have,
which has been fairly. We've been fairly consistent over time. We've seen a couple of blips with Democrats really outnumbering.
But I know there's one number in here that I know jumped out for Jay DeDapper when he was looking at it, and it had to do with the record strongly.
Are you putting words in his mouth?
No. I'm just passing it over to him. The strongly disapprove.
Yeah, I mean, 49% strongly disapprove. That is one shy of 50%, which is what you need to win an election. Well, not in the popular vote, but whatever. 49% strongly disapprove. These are basically 49% of Americans. I mean, they hate this guy. That is unbelievable at this stage of an election year. That is really historic and unbelievable. Now, George Bush was not liked in his second term, near the end as the economy tanked. There are certainly precedent for this, but we've talked for 3 years about how Donald Trump's numbers essentially don't really change. His approval rating runs from 40 to 43, 44%. His disapproval, which has climbed, did not get up to this level before. It was in the low 50s. I think it is remarkable that his strongly disapproved number is this high. And I don't think we're going to see the approved number dip, because those 40% are baked in.
Yeah.
They're just not going to change. It's what happens on the other side that I think is pretty dramatic.
So with all these toss-ups, go ahead, Barb.
No, go ahead. I was going to actually mention the toss-ups.
Then I'll let you mention the toss-ups.
So we did. I mean, the other question we did ask about the president was a toss-up question between him and Joe Biden, and we found not a statistical difference from our earlier June poll. Biden with 52%. Support, and Trump with 44%. It had gone from a 7-point Biden lead to now an 8-point Biden lead. And not really much shifting, underneath those top numbers either.
Yeah, well, and also there's people have been seeing the New York Times Siena poll, perhaps they've seen the Quinnipiac poll, a lot of state polls, and they're showing a very, convincing lead for Joe Biden, because basically if he carries everything Hillary carried, plus Michigan and Pennsylvania, he just needs one more. And he's ahead in Arizona, Florida, Michigan there. We just mentioned North Carolina. He's ahead in Pennsylvania. He's ahead in Wisconsin.
He's ahead in Ohio in the Q poll.
Yeah, and pretty even in other places where he, all things being equal, he'd be trailing. But word of caution, as Jay said in the beginning, it's still early. These are registered voters, not likely voters. And I think when we see the switch over in the fall, that could make a difference. But right now, the president has some electoral problems.
There's one other thing before we move on about these state polls from New York Times and Siena that I note, because we've talked a lot about a number, or something that we talk about is persuadables. Who's out there that's persuadable? And I think a lot of people think nobody's persuadable. You like Donald Trump, you hate Donald Trump. There's nobody in the middle. If you look at the independent numbers, though, in these races, Arizona, Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, the Times and Siena College did, there is a much bigger undecided. So in Arizona, it's only 84% of independents have made a pick or say they do. 78% in Florida. That's basically three-quarters. A quarter of independent voters are saying that they're persuadable or haven't made up their minds. Now, they may not vote, but I think that's worth noting, is that there is an independent set of voters here that are not baked into what they're going to do, or at least not telling pollsters what they're going to do.
Yeah, so we're seeing right now this lead. Donald Trump has to pivot it, given his low approval rating, or he's got to figure out a way to get Joe Biden into this race and engage him, because he doesn't want to make it a referendum on Donald Trump. Very hard for him to play second fiddle. As we know, he likes to lead the orchestra. And so that's sort of a look at where we are right now in the toss-ups.
So an awful lot of what we have talked about this year is not what we thought we would be talking about if you had asked us in December or January, which is we've been talking about this pandemic. And the last week we have seen it disappeared out of the news for a couple of weeks, and boy, is it back. And it's back because it is back in a very, very serious way in terms of the number of infections and hospitalizations and all of that. We wanted to think about what happens on the other side of this. And it seems a little weird to talk about that right now because it has come storming back, but there will be another side of this. There will be a time when there's a vaccine, when this is in our rearview mirror. But what will it look like? This is a huge impact. Look at the economy. This is just a huge thing that's happened to us. And so we've looked back at time, as we do in polls and other historic events, to try and think about what the past can tell us about what the future holds. And one of them is 9/11. I mean, that's one of the events we've talked about. What did we learn about what changed in 9/11 that tells us what we might expect to see change now or in the future, after this pandemic?
Well, I think we saw, crises do a lot of things for Americans, and it's 9/11. Obviously that, changed that whole equation for George Bush in the short term. People then get, the country was, changed on the topic of terrorism like we had never been before. And, it's that time. You can go back to World War II, the Depression, what that did, and, then the war in terms of public policy, Social Security and other things coming on during the Great Depression. I mean, it's not unlike, major events and crises to get Americans focused, because we can't just hang out and let everything play as usual does. So I think this is a big difference.
Right, but Barb, there's policy changes and then there's cultural changes.
If we take 9/11 as a first example, I think that was a tremendous shift in the American psyche. First, just in terms of Americans' perceptions of our role in the world. It was a jolt in the sense that we thought we were the superpower, invincible, the country that guided and directed global policy and global direction. And not only was this the first time that we had literally had an attack, on our soil
since Pearl Harbor.
Since Pearl Harbor,
Yeah.
Correct, yeah. It was something that really shook the country to its core. And I think over the 2 decades that we have had since 9/11, this decline in Americans' perceptions about our role in the world has continued. The other thing too is the change in policy in terms of what Americans, the range of policy that Americans were considered important, particularly with regard to privacy, particularly with regard to travel. We had the certainly much more power put into the TSA, but also the Patriot Act, which allowed the government to take a much greater role in surveillance of Americans and other types of communications that Americans were having. And I'm thinking particularly of all of the recording and cell phone tracking and social media tracking as well. So it was not only a dramatic change in self-perception and how we also viewed people of Muslim descent. It was really a dramatic change also in the type of policy and the things that we thought was acceptable for government to do, which was just a complete sea change from the day before.
With a sudden event, what's interesting with this particular issue, this crisis, the pandemic, this is a long-lasting event. And I think there's a lot of areas that we're going to, first of all, I'm very happy to be talking about any topic that says post-pandemic in the beginning, because I'm just,
we're trying to be helpful.
Yes, just to sort of set our gaze differently. But I think we're going to have, look, we're all on Zoom right now. We're talking to each other remotely. I think there's going to be a huge change in the way communication takes place. We're seeing it in the campaign. We're going to see it in every aspect of our lives and how we work, how we interact, the whole bit. And I also think that we're going to see a big change public policy-wise in the role of public health in this country. We've had a clear debate from everything to whether you're supposed to wear a mask or not, to the role of science. I mean, I think that's a big deal coming out of the pandemic as it is right now. And then also the topic that we're seeing going on right now in other venues is the whole issue of protests, which seems to be spun off because of the pandemic and other, tragic events. So I think coming out of this, a lot is going to be different from what it was, just a few months ago.
Yeah, I think you're dead on in terms of the kind of the cultural impact, the work impact, the way that we communicate. I think that's all right. I wonder what the impact, though, is that is harder to measure, that we couldn't really pick up in polls. I don't know that polls or even history is a good guide for this, because we'd have to go back to like the Black Plague and ask people then. We can't really do that. What happens on the other side of this to the way that we interact with other people in person?
Well, it's interesting because I think a lot of people have pointed to the polio epidemic in the 1950s, where there was this incredible shift, particularly among parents protecting their children. And this is something that was not just, a summer event. This was something that took years and years, and it was a decade before there was a vaccine that was, provided, en masse to the public. So that was something that changed culturally, and it did change how parents allowed their children to interact with other children and the activities that they were allowed to participate in. Of course, it then all gives birth to the 1960s. So I don't know what the implications are there, but it does seem that we do rebound short of another generation. But there's no doubt that these major events not only have impact on our psyche, culturally, but also in terms of policy. So I think you're suggesting, Lee, that it's the healthcare policy that may have a big impact because of the virus, but certainly we are moving in a very different direction given the protests and the killing of George Floyd, which I think was really heightened everyone's feelings towards these issues because of how we had been so isolated from each other due to the pandemic.
Yeah, and so as if there weren't enough issues, there's one more issue. Jay promised an awful lot today. There's one more issue that we want to talk about before we go, and that's the whole issue of public support or not for the taking down of these Confederate monuments. Obviously, you just alluded, Barb, to the George Floyd murder, and then we have so many other instances have come to the fore, and people are keyed on this whole issue, and that has raised or re-brought into the public view the issue of Confederate symbols. And what the polls tell us, I think, are very interesting, and I think somewhat surprising. As recently as August of 2017, so we're talking less than 3 years ago, my things change quickly. In our poll, 62% nationally told us that leaders of the Confederacy, well, these were historic symbols and they should be left alone. Quinnipiac similarly found people were opposed to removing these around the country. Yet now, in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, we're seeing support for the removal, a majority, and that's a big deal. And we may want to talk about the manner with which they're being removed. I'm not sure that is as popular as it might be, but certainly people want to turn the page on the Confederacy. Yeah, NASCAR, others. Yeah, it's a different day out there right now.
Well, also, and if you just take the example of Black Lives Matter, it wasn't too long ago that it was considered, radical, marginal group without much public support, and it's very much mainstream.
I think, look, the Confederate thing has always baffled me, and this is not new for me. And anybody who knows me knows that this goes all the way back to like when I was even in college, and I honestly could not understand why, as a nation, we put the names of essentially traitors. Confederacy they were traitors. They turned, to try and destroy the Union, right? Why we would put the names of traitorous generals or generals that fought against this country on schools and roads and airports and put monuments in them all over, and why we would be so okay about flying a flag that, if we flew a Nazi flag, is everybody good? I mean, it's the same thing. They fought against the United States. We don't treat any other enemies against the U.S. We've never treated any other enemies against the U.S. like we treat the Confederacy, and they were the enemy. That's what a civil war is all about. I have never understood that, and frankly, I'm only surprised it has taken this long for this issue to come to this level of prominence, where people actually thought through what it means to see the Confederate flag, what it means to have a general like Lee on a statue in a capital of an American city. I mean, to me, this is a really long time in coming. And the only surprising thing is it took this long for it to rise to this level of prominence.
Are you also baffled that the wear a mask or not wear a mask is a political issue and not a healthcare issue?
Well, that's different. Yes.
Yeah, you are. I thought you might be.
You're getting all my baffling things out here. Yeah.
Yeah, but
anyway.
No, I agree. And it is ironic, barely a strong enough word, that the Confederate flag is waved by those who would score higher on a patriot scale than others.
Yeah.
And they also might be against First Amendment freedoms too.
Right.
So the whole thing has gotten at that level very confused. But I think we're getting clarity to credit of the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, that's where it's
absolutely. I do think this risks going really off the rails, though, when protesters are pulling down statues of Abraham Lincoln that were paid for by freed Black slaves and dedicated by Frederick Douglass. I think when you've come that far to the other side and you're basically just tearing down anything that's made of bronze that's on a pedestal, I think that you risk really, really overstepping what this moment can do. And I think that is always a danger in any movement, but that seems, I would really be interested to see if this takes the course that it's currently taking, where the next set of polls has Americans.
But I'll say that when you see the videos of the folks, young folks, pulling down the statues, they're mostly white. And I think needs to be said, because a lot of people in the Black Lives Matters movement are not happy about that part, because it might, like the violence did in some of the protests, it can serve to delegitimize the very serious issues that they're trying to put on the table and move ahead in a policy wise.
Yeah.
No, I think there are pretty significant extremes, particularly trying to undermine some of the changes that are going on right now. And I think that may be something of what we're seeing as well. But clearly, there's been a sea change, and if hate to take it back to Donald Trump, but I think he's having a tough time because it's really just not as he remembers it. And a position of law and order is not resonating with the constituencies that he thinks that it would. It's a much different tone, and it's a much bigger issue than he's characterizing right now. So we'll have to see what happens there.
Yeah, the silent majority doesn't appear to be a majority, not particularly.
Or silent.
Yeah.
Jay,
Well,
you were
lots of polls and issues to discuss this week. That's not going to stop. My guess is that all the way through November, many of our episodes will be as packed as this, as these issues bounce around and we see what the American public has to say. For this edition, however, of Poll Hub, we bring it to a close. Poll Hub is a production of Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. We, of course, are all remote today and not on campus, but we do believe there will be an opportunity for one or two of us to be back on campus in the coming months as New York State slowly opens up. Casey Schaff is our editor, Mary Griffith is our executive producer, and Amelia Morell, as always, provides incredible amounts of data and help to us in putting together these segments.
Are you trying to get more money? Are we trying to get a raise here? Are you lobbying? I mean, Amelia's always getting all these plugs and pundits.
Yeah.
Amelia, how heavy is the dog Hudson now? You have to update us.
I think he's 28 pounds.
Oh God! Every week.
Okay.
Every week.
The new puppy is growing by leaps and bounds.
Well, one of the places Amelia checks is in the Roper Center Archives at Cornell, which we've depended on throughout our nearly 3 years of doing this. And we look back at surveys and results over time, as we have in this very episode.
Yes, and please, we do love to see your comments, at least most of them. Well, we get all sorts of fan mail. We do ask your opinion in a lot of different ways, as we are now as well.
That's air quotes around fan mail, Barb.
So if you do have questions or comments, do reach out to us on social at Marist Poll on Twitter and Marist Poll on Facebook and Instagram. We love to plug the Marist Poll Academy. There's a lot to learn there. It's online and it's free, and it can actually answer a lot of the technical questions and some of the issues. We do some case studies on a number of the issues that we often speak about on the podcast. And finally, if you like what you hear, leave us a review. Tell us, tell others what you think. And while you're at it, make sure that you also subscribe. So stay safe, and thanks for listening.